What makes this part of the story unsettling isn't what my grandfather could have done. It's what he chose not to do. From the outside, it's easy to assume that power only looks one way. Immediate force, a quick trigger, a clean ending. But real power, especially in moments like these, often shows up as restraint. The German officer expected violence. He expected it fast because that's how authority had always worked for him. Orders given, consequences delivered, no waiting. What he wasn't prepared for was time. 4 long days of it. Stretching out in front of him like a sentence he couldn't read the end of. My grandfather understood something crucial. Fear doesn't peak at the moment of danger. It peaks in the waiting. In the silence. In the hours when nothing happens and your mind fills in the blanks with worst-case scenarios. By not acting immediately, he flipped the balance. The officer still had his life. But he no longer had control over it. And that uncertainty was far more destabilizing than a quick death would have been. Every sunrise became a question mark. Every footstep, every pause in conversation, carried weight. My grandfather didn't need to raise his voice or his hand. The situation itself did the work for him. What's important here is that this wasn't cruelty for spectacle's sake. It was calculated, yes, but also deeply human. My grandfather had lived under the opposite kind of power. Sudden, absolute, indifferent. He knew what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone who didn't see you as a person. So instead of repeating that pattern instantly, he slowed everything down. He forced the officer to live inside the same uncertainty that others had been forced to live with. For years. Not knowing what would happen next. Not knowing when the end would come. That slow erosion of confidence was the real shift in power. Over those 4 days, the officer went from rigid certainty to visible unease. Authority relies on predictability. Once that disappears, the uniform means very little. My grandfather let him speak, let him sit, let him wait. And in that waiting, the officer was stripped of the thing that had protected him most. The illusion that he was untouchable. There were no shouted threats, no dramatic gestures. Just the quiet understanding that the rules had changed, and he didn't know what the new ones were. This is where patience becomes a weapon, not in a violent sense but in a psychological one. My grandfather didn't rush because he didn't need to. He already had what mattered. Control of the moment. Each day that passed reinforced the same message. Your fate is no longer yours to command. And that realization, creeping in slowly, does something profound to a person. It forces them to confront vulnerability. Something the officer had likely never experienced in a meaningful way before. There's also something deeply uncomfortable about recognizing how effective this kind of restraint can be. We're used to stories where strength looks loud and decisive. But here, strength was quiet. It was the ability to sit with tension without releasing it. To let time do the work instead of violence. My grandfather understood that acting immediately would have ended the situation. But it wouldn't have taught anything. It would have been an escape. For both of them. By dragging it out. He made the officer stay present with what he'd done. Who he'd been, and what it felt like to be powerless. And yet, even in this, there's a line my grandfather never crossed. The goal wasn't chaos or sadism. It was reversal. For 4 days, the officer lived in a world where he was no longer the one deciding outcomes. That alone was enough to break the structure he'd relied on. When you remove certainty from someone who has built their identity on control, everything else starts to unravel on its own. This part of the story matters because it challenges the idea that mercy and strength can't coexist. My grandfather's restraint wasn't softness. It was discipline. It was knowing that the most devastating thing he could take from the officer wasn't his life, but his sense of dominance. And once that was gone, the uniform, the rank, the ideology, all of it became meaningless. By the end of those 4 days, the lesson had already landed. The officer had learned, in the most personal way possible, that power can be taken, authority can dissolve, and fear doesn't belong exclusively to the weak. Sometimes, the cruelest and most effective lesson isn't delivered in a moment of violence, but stretched across time, forcing someone to sit with the consequences of who they chose to be. What makes the second part of this story harder to sit with is that it refuses to be clean or comforting. By the 4th day, this wasn't just about control anymore. It had become a mirror. My grandfather wasn't trying to erase the officer from the world. He was forcing him to see himself in it. And that's where the cruelty takes on a different shape. Not the kind that screams or spills blood, but the kind that presses quietly on your chest and doesn't let you look away. For years, that officer had lived inside a system that rewarded distance. Distance from consequence. Distance from suffering, distance from the people affected by his decisions. Orders came down, actions followed, and whatever happened afterward belonged to someone else. Someone weaker. Someone faceless. My grandfather understood that killing him outright would have let that distance remain intact. It would have ended the story before the lesson began. So instead, he collapsed that distance and made everything personal. Over those 4 days, the officer wasn't beaten into understanding. He was left alone with it. With time to remember faces instead of ranks. With space to feel what it's like when no one explains what's coming next. That's the part people miss when they hear the word lesson. This wasn't about lecturing or moral speeches. It was experiential. My grandfather recreated, as closely as he could, the emotional reality that had been imposed on others. Fear, waiting, powerlessness. And made the officer live inside it. There's something deeply uncomfortable about that. Because it blurs the line between justice and revenge. And my grandfather knew that. He wasn't pretending to be above anger or grief. He had lost people. He had seen things that didn't leave you. The difference is that he didn't let those feelings explode outward in a single moment. He contained them. Focused them. He made the officer confront the human cost of his role not through pain, but through recognition. As the days passed, the officer's confidence didn't just fade. It hollowed out. When you strip away the machinery of power, what's left is a person who has to answer questions he's never asked himself. What does your authority mean when no one obeys you? What does your ideology offer when it can't protect you? Sitting with those questions is agonizing. Especially for someone who has never had to doubt their position in the world. This is where the cruelty becomes paradoxical. My grandfather didn't deny the officer his humanity. He forced him to feel it. And that's often far more painful. Feeling hunger when meals are uncertain. Feeling relief when nothing bad happens. Followed immediately by dread that it might still be coming. Feeling hope, then realizing how fragile it is. These are experiences the officer had likely inflicted on others without ever touching them directly. Now they were his. At the same time, my grandfather never let the situation slide into chaos. There were boundaries. Structure. The lesson wasn't, anything can happen, but you are not the one who decides anymore. That distinction matters. It's what separates this from mindless cruelty. The officer wasn't reduced to an object. He was reduced to equality. To the same vulnerability that had once defined the lives of people he considered beneath him. And that's where the moral weight of this story sits. My grandfather wasn't trying to purify the world or balance some cosmic scale. He was making a statement about responsibility. About what it means to carry out harm under the protection of authority and then claim innocence. Because you followed orders. Over 4 days, that excuse had nowhere to hide. There was no system to absorb the blame. Just one man and the reality of what it feels like to have no control. By the end, the lesson didn't need to be spoken out loud. It had already settled in. The officer had learned that dehumanization works both ways. That once you build a world where people are reduced to roles and numbers, you can't be shocked when you're treated the same. My grandfather didn't tell him this. He let him arrive there on his own, which made it impossible to dismiss. What lingers most for me is that this story doesn't offer an easy answer about right and wrong. It sits in that uneasy space where survival, justice, and cruelty overlap. My grandfather didn't walk away untouched by those 4 days. Teaching that lesson meant carrying it too. That's something people often forget. Restraint doesn't erase the cost. It just shifts where it's paid. In the end, this wasn't about forgiveness or redemption. It was about acknowledgement. Forcing someone who had lived above consequence to finally feel it in his bones. Not for a moment, but long enough for it to matter. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all. The idea that the sharpest form of justice isn't always swift or violent, but slow, intimate, and impossible to ignore.